Firewater is very honored, actually, to welcome Professor Saradindu Bhaduri, to pronounce it well today, to talk about frugal innovation. He works at the Center for Studies in Science Policy at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. And he's here in the Netherlands on and off for from September 2015 it was, until September this year, at the Center for Frugal Innovation in Africa, together with the International Institute of Social Studies, because he's the chairholder of the Prince Claus Chair for Development and Equity. Is that correct? Yeah. And your thematic focus is on frugal innovation for development and equity. And during this lunch seminar, we will get a glimpse of your work, I guess, and the possibility to discuss your work afterwards. So it will be around half an hour of presentation and then 15 minutes of discussion. It's organized by Firewater, and Firewater is a Dutch program that supports innovative projects that solve water problems in African countries. And we are actually interested in his work because of the possible links and connections. Because we are working with water innovators, and all the work he's doing has a lot of similarities, and we would like to learn from each other. We will also record this presentation and we'll put it on the website, because many of our listeners will not be present here today. And you can find more information about Firewater at firewater.nl. My name, I didn't tell you yet, is Willemijn Nagel, and my colleagues Roos and Titia would all like to wish you an interesting and fruitful, or should I say frugal, in a lunch seminar today.
Yes.
Okay, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Willima, and it's an honor to be here, and especially for the kind of mixture that you have of practitioners and students. And this is, I think, one of the most ideal environment for a researcher to come and share his or her ideas, because you get a broad range of comments, and that always helps. And so I'm looking forward to the discussion as well. Well, by the end of the discussion, I think at least you would gain a kind of a confidence that frugal is not necessarily something to look down upon. If some of you may have been thinking about it because of the way this discourse has emerged. Okay, I have a kind of a plan, and I'll touch upon these points, but we can come back to the discussion if you think some of the points have not been highlighted enough. And that's always a possibility. In the last bullet, I always maintain that being an academician, it's difficult, although it's very tempting for me to give a policy suggestion, but one should appreciate the fact that we do operate at a level of abstraction where giving a straightforward policy roadmap might not work. And so I prefer to use it as a conjectural roadmap, right? Something that is sort of projected, but one can negotiate with that. Okay, frugal innovation has actually at least two very different kinds of meanings when it comes to dominate the discussion in the social science literature. One is quite new, and that talks about how to produce cheap, easy to use products, and products with no frills, as they say. So for example, you don't need a kind of an Apple iPhone with 120 different applications, but you might need a smartphone with 15 applications, but all of them are useful. And of course, for resource constraint setting, There is a bit of an emphasis on sustainability, sharing economies in the frugal innovation literature. So if we go beyond, say, the product innovation or technical innovation and come to like service innovation, then this sharing Uber taxi arrangements, things like that, can also be linked to the broader discourse on frugal innovation. But these innovations are mostly undertaken by large firms. They are not, at least in this literature, are not really talking about innovations done by smaller firms, innovation done by people who themselves have to make use of them. But in order to carry out these innovations, these firms, and that's a very interesting point, they had to learn from the largely, very broadly defined behavioral characteristics or behavioral regularities from the people or of the people living in that situation. So how do people take decisions in that kind of a situation? How do they organize their behavior? And there are quite a few papers which would ask you to learn that and implement that in your business context, right? So there is a learning taking place from the so-called bottom of the pyramid, but not really the activities of theirs are defined as frugal innovation. Frugal innovation finally has to be done by the large firms. And what is the outcome of that? The outcome is that you produce certain products through which you integrate these people in the bottom of the pyramid with the market. So earlier, they were not able to access the market or the products available in the market, and these kinds of innovation make it accessible, right? So there is a gain in terms of getting access to the market and the marketable products. However, when we look deeper, or when you read newspapers, in both situations, you get a very different understanding of what is frugal innovation. For example, if I talk about frugal innovation, you will not really think of something which is designed by very large firms, right? And incidentally or ironically, that's also the case when you talk to, for example, some PhDs in history, rural development, literature, religion. They have a very different meaning of frugal and frugality than what was highlighted by the discourse on frugal innovation. And that was one of our departure points. So that means there is something else than what they say about frugal innovation in terms of its scope, in terms of its applicability. And then when we started digging it deep, we found that this is something which even Adam Smith had talked about, and very clearly distinguishing it from behavior which are prodigal in nature, which are lavish in nature, right? And what are the kinds of characteristics, or what are the characteristics he attached to those activities? They are basically, characteristics which would make some people more industrious, right? More judicious, who would rely on one's experiential knowledge. So even if something is not available in the coded theory, and he gives an example of 4th century AD Roman context, where they didn't have a kind of kitchen gardens used to be a very, very profitable, very effective activities, right? But they had nothing to hedge kitchen gardens. And the theories of those days which were existing, they didn't tell us anything which would be economically feasible as well as sustainable. So either they were costing more than what the kitchen gardens would give you in return, or they were not sustainable. And then he talks about an agricultural, a farmer who used his experiential knowledge to identify a few plants which could be used as hedging or for hedging. And Adam Smith refers to that as how experiential knowledge brought into frugality, right? So it's more to do with things which are not even proven in theory, but they can be identified through one's experience in the particular context or institutional setting. Now, we find that quite useful, a starting point for a different discourse on frugality and frugal innovation. Now, again, I mean, it has been used and not used at the same time. In decision theory, there is a particular branch of discourse which actually tries to identify frugality with such things. They mostly talk about making decisions in a resource-constrained environment, and resource for them is mostly information or access to information. For example, a patient comes to a doctor with some signs which could be of a cardiac arrest, right? You don't have much technical equipments in your disposal. You can refer the person to somewhere, and you have to take a decision whether it actually belongs to some kind of a danger area in terms of the symptoms. What do? Many hospitals had designed a protocol for that. And the protocol would mean that you have to do, say, like 6-7 blood tests, and they would be checked for 59 parameters. And then you get to, you compare those 59 parameters, come to a decision, which they called an optimum decision. But it's difficult without those machines. And even if the machines are available, doctors would not always pay attention to those. They would perhaps like to go by their own intuition about the symptoms, and would often do maybe a kind of a handful of tests and refer to a particular area, right, or a department. Now, in most of the cases, their judgment was found to be quite effective and true. I mean, at least it didn't perform worse than those who followed the other methodology. Right? And so, based on such experiments in a sense, they came out with a kind of a contours of what do you mean by frugality and frugal decision making. And the attempt here is to take from that conceptual framework and emphasize on some of these things. That frugality is not only or even mainly about a cheap product, or for that matter, product. It is actually more about the process of producing a product, right? So how it is achieved is more important when we discuss frugality than what is actually achieved. Because in case of these doctors, what they achieved is a good decision. They send the patient to the right kind of department. But how is it achieved is a more important question. What kind of rules they used? Whether they did optimization, and optimization is a very interesting word. Nobody would like to hear that I'm not optimizing with this environment or in this environment, right? But at the same time, if we go to the core of this concept of optimization, it actually leads to so much of this information that I just referred to you about. It actually wants me to understand all the pros and cons of all the options available, and then make a comparison between all those options and come to the best solution. And we hardly take our decisions based on that, right? It talks about how to adapt to the environmental challenges. So when you do not have a machine, how do you function, take decisions in a particular setup? And how do you learn? And imitation is not a bad word actually when it comes to human behavior. We all do imitate, and imitation is an activity which is important for our learning. Yeah. The final point about the frugal and the frugality is it actually values a lot on what is happening in the actual environment, and not so much on what ought to happen because a model has told me this. Yeah? Now, this is not to say that, well, the models are not effective, but it is to say actually to mean something else, that sometimes or quite often we undervalue this part and put a more than proportionate importance to that part, right? So we develop a nice prototype, and then we say that, well, my technology was very good, but it didn't work. People didn't buy it. Now the question is, from a frugality perspective, we are actually making the table upside down a bit. We say, let's see what works in the environment. And since it is, after all, within the premise of UNESCO, which mixes science with culture, I find it's not so out of place to give an example of an activity done by Rabindranath Tagore, who was a Nobel laureate in 1913. So he's not best known for his contribution in science, but he actually carried out a rural reconstruction program in one part of India, and where he specifically mentioned that I would pay emphasis on daily usage more than scientific validation of something. So if something is working, to me that is important. I need to go behind the scene and try to understand what makes it work, rather than trying to see that whether it conforms to the all logical scientific rules of how things should work. Right? But this is a different viewpoint. But at the same time, he didn't talk about dismissing science. But what he perhaps put an emphasis on, that science has to have a kind of collaboration with these activities which are often dismissed by the institution of science as scientific. Now, of course, this is a different debate. We can spend hours on that, but I'll not go into that for the time being. Okay. Now, what really drives these innovations? What really, when we talk about such decisions, when we talk about innovations by the poor people, well, not so much poor in the sense that, actually they might be quite rich in that local context, but poor in the sense that they would not necessarily be having the technical education or the resources that is needed to, for example, collaborate with the larger scientific world. And their focus would be to solve the local problems at times, right? So poor is a very nuanced word here. And we get to see, and some of our research has shown that in most cases, these innovations are driven by practical experience, of course, but along with that, the value that one finds in using them. Now, in economics, there are two very dominant kinds of values that we talk about. One is the use value, and the other is the exchange value. The exchange value comes with the social use value. So if something gets a valued in a society, then we would assume that social value would be reflected in terms of an exchange value or a price. But here we see that these innovations, although they are used in the society, but they do not get transacted in a market. So it's a different situation where people may copy it with or without the recognition or the acknowledgement of the person. And there is a social value out of it, but the social value does not quite generate a price, or they remain not a marketable product as such in a strong sense of the term. And why we say it's a cross-sectoral approach? It's a cross-sectoral approach because, say, for example, when they have to deal with a problem of food security, they would not either focus on water or on seeds in a very partitioned manner. You will see they are actually targeting more than one thing in their approach. So, for example, there was a case of food insecurity because in many parts of India, you boil the rice before you sell them. You boil them, dry them, and then sell or eat. And in the process, they were actually losing quite a bit of rice because it got, the technology was such that you lose 50% of the produce. Now, somebody tried to address it. So there was the problem not only in terms of food security, but women were spending more time there. And somebody actually did not want to address the food security issue, but address the issue of women empowerment in a way. And they developed, along with the feedback of the community, a machine where it can be done more efficiently and better recovery rate, and which actually freed the time of women from doing this to do something else. So, some of these innovative responses are not really clearly sectoral in focus, right? They manage different things through a particular problem-solving attitude. And I had these 3 links, actually. If you want, I can take you to these websites, or I can just mention about them, and you can look at the websites later. Yeah, that's not a problem. The other example I was just talking about was an attempt in Kenya where somebody has made, and I believe nowadays there are a few more of those. They have made security poles out of plastics. So what they are trying to address here, they are trying to address sustainability. At the same time, high demand of security poles, because if you have been to Kenya, you would know that security industry is one of the thriving industry there, right? Security poles, more security poles meaning more deforestation, right? But if you can make use of plastic to make it, then you are saving on wood logs, but you are also trying to make a disposal mechanism of your plastic waste, right? And we spoke to that person. It was actually a bit of a trial and error activities which finally led to a successful implementation of that, right? A third example, or here it's actually the second one, is somebody in India made edible cutlery. Yeah? So you have spoons which you can eat when you don't find any use of it. And through that, once again, if we talk about sustainability, they actually addressed it at a quite different 3 levels. First of all, it encouraged people to use less of plastics, and therefore plastic wastes would get reduced. It led to a changeover in the cropping pattern from rice to sorghum. And some of us would know that sorghum is much better suited for dry environment. So it actually required less water. It gave better connection with the market in a sense, because sorghum is much more of a cash crop than rice. So in different ways, it tries to address the concerns of sustainability, concerns of farmers' empowerment, and it made good business sense, because now I believe there are quite a lot of crowdfunding that it has been able to generate. But once again, that was not really the first motive of any of these innovations. Yeah. So what we see here is there are varying degree of success possible in terms of commercialization, but all of them are very strongly embedded in a particular context and social relations. Now, social relations, for example, when we said to this person in Kenya, that's a nice thing, we can try to have it in Europe. He said, wait a minute, you might actually not be able to do it in Europe. Why? Because, in Europe, plastic is collected or garbage is collected by the municipality. And if you collect it from the municipality, it's a very different kind of a distribution logic, price mechanism, and you might actually not get it in the way you want. So you have to actually deal with quite a lot of regulation here and there before you can make it feasible, right? And so similar thing can be said about the other 2 innovations perhaps more easily, yeah, because it's a particular context which has motivated such innovations. And this brings us to a very interesting debate on scaling of innovation. You know, it's always a kind of a dilemma that which is the appropriate scale of production, how big or how large, how many more should we be producing. Yeah? Now this gives us a good context to relook at that debate, and some of my colleagues at in the Department of Design Studies in the University of Delft, they are toying with a very interesting idea here, context variation by design. So they say that for design theorists actually, the same problem can happen, whether we produce mass scale products and then try to see whether everybody likes it, or we go to specific sections and try to produce something which is of value to them. And then we are not necessarily talking about scaling up or down, but they used a very interesting word which I have to still sort of probe further to know what it means, is scaling out. Yeah? So the question is that these complexities are not a challenge to you, but they are part and parcel of your activities, and you just deal with that. In a sense, frugal innovation discourse in a larger domain of it talks about that. It actually claims to give a kind of a intellectual roadmap on how to conceptualize a production system which is not like a mass production, standardized production regime, which offers something different than that. This is one of the claims that the frugal innovation literature is trying to make these days. But what we also found in many of these research is that it's very difficult for these people to either arrange funds or even to access the knowledge available in the mainstream arena. So in India, for example, many of these innovations would not be even touched by the scientists. Many of them would be saying, well, this is something which people often say trash, for example, right? So there is a kind of a hierarchy that we observe, and that makes these innovative activities difficult to flourish, both in terms of access to finance and access to knowledge. Now, that's why I started with those examples where we talked about the importance of experiential knowledge. Now, this is, again, to reiterate, so not to suggest that the formal body of science is less important. It actually to suggest that the experiential knowledge is perhaps equally, or if not more, important in specific context, and they need to be taken into account. So what kind of a policy roadmap we suggest? Unfortunately, we see these innovations happening in many places, but at the same time, we always try to mainstream them. That let's see how they can be patented. Let's see how they can be commercialized. Well, they are important in today's world. But the question is, at times, suppose they are not commercializable. Are they meaningless? So if we put commercialization as the only motive behind these innovations, then actually these innovations can dry up looking at the possibilities that it's very difficult to commercialize them. But if we look at the particular context where they were solving a problem which the mainstream market was not able to solve, or in many cases even the state was not willing to or able to solve, and they were solving those problems, and now what happens is, because of this incentivization of these activities in terms of giving them rights or access to market which at times may not work, there are actually dangers of these innovations getting dried up. And this is quite in line with the theoretical prediction of effectance motivation theories, which says that people who are guided by intrinsic motivations, their motivation can crowd out if you put more and more extrinsic incentives to drive their behavior. For example, it was attempted to incentivize blood donation by giving money to people who would give blood. It actually reduced the supply of blood because people thought that we are not giving blood for money. Of course, there would be some people who would do that because of different necessities, but a majority would not give blood because of money. I was giving it for something else. Now, if you want me to give money for that, I better know. So there are certain examples of this kind which has been used to formulate this theoretical discourse around motivation and intrinsic motivations. And some of our work have shown that it actually is a very valid point to discuss before we talk about policy making for such innovations in these setups. So what is required? As I might have pointed out, although I haven't said it, but it was there in one of the bullets, that they use their own money or money from sources where they do not have to meet a very strict repayment guidelines. Because these are part of their livelihood strategies. So they don't have really a time-bound project which will yield money after 2 years, and so on. So it's very difficult for them to access formal sources of funding. And perhaps a bit out of context, but it was indeed true that there was this report came out in the Indian context last year, a data prepared by the National Crime Bureau, that the farmers who took loans from formal banks, state-funded banks at times, the suicide rate among those farmers are much, much higher than those who took money from informal money lenders. Now, we all believe, or we all have been thinking, that the formal source of money lending should replace the informal money lenders' practices because these are exploitative in nature. But at the same time, perhaps, the informal money lenders would like their potential payees to survive. And so there would be a mechanism where they would carry on, even if they have to pay a lot more interest on their payments. So there are certain kinds of flexibilities that they might be offering, which we haven't researched though. But it's a very interesting and very intriguing an outcome. And I try to sort of put it into the discussion to find out if it shows something else, if it signals some different kind of funding pattern that would be necessary to support these innovations. And in that context, what could be the role of so-called corporate social responsibility? Because this is also a kind of a funding which should not, even if it does not, it should not come with many strings attached, right? I mean, this is not really a business that these firms are doing, but a 2% of their sales turnover on corporate social responsibility might be actually a good lot of money for many such communities. Yeah, can that be channelized in a more systematic manner to support such activities across the globe? The role of the sympathetic outsiders, those who come work with the community, is more or less well accepted. Yeah, but we need to also perhaps some of the works that you do can fall in that category where there are people who do not belong to that context, but they are sensitive to that context. They go, they work with their communities. But in that work, again, my emphasis would be how to ensure that there is a non-hierarchical exchange of knowledge taking place between the outsiders, sympathetic or otherwise, and the people who are facing the problem situations. So the final comment would be that a framework which would appreciate such frugal processes, that is, which would pay more attention to things that work in an environment than trying to perhaps validate a design which seeks to attain a kind of universality in its application, would be desirable. And why I say so, if we go back to the Industrial Revolution discourse, we actually see that Wright brothers could fly 10 or 15 years before the physics of wings were designed or they got established. So there is perhaps something in that knowledge exchange. And if you look at the history of Industrial Revolution, there are new insights coming that how, along with other things, how this unique capability that England could have at that time to mix or combine the theoretical codified body of knowledge with the practitioner's knowledge made a contribution to Industrial Revolution. Because none of or many of these innovations or inventions were done in England. Many of them came from France, but France was not the place where the Industrial Revolution took place. Right? So, in a sense, this particular approach, which focuses on actual environment, how people take decisions in actual environment, perhaps has a lot of opportunities to face, or to deal with the current challenges of mass-based production, mass-scale production, standardized production, and its limits that we are achieving. But this, of course, is kind of a claim as of now, which we are working towards from various angles, trying to see how it can be established. So I stop here, and thank you for your attention. And I'd love to take any questions.